The pre-dawn gloom enveloped the boundless steppes, where the high, waist-deep grass still held the night's coolness, but the air was already electrified with a tension that seemed to make silence itself ring. This was not just the calm before the storm, it was the last second before the world was to split in two. July 5th, 1943. At this moment, along a giant arc stretching for hundreds of kilometers, millions of people stood frozen. In the cramped space of the trench, a young signalman, clutching a telephone receiver, heard static crackling in it, as if the sky itself was warning of the impending apocalypse. His fingers, stained with chernozem and machine oil, trembled not from fear, but from unbearable anticipation. Beside him, an elderly sergeant who had served in the previous war silently wiped the bolt of his rifle with a rag, peering into the gray horizon, where the silhouettes of an alien steel armada were already discernible. Never before in human history had such destructive power been concentrated in such a limited area. The earth, rich, fertile, having fed peasants for centuries, was now preparing to absorb thousands of tons of incandescent iron. Somewhere in the distance, a low, vibrating hum like an approaching earthquake was heard. It was the engines of 1,000 tanks warming up, mechanical beasts, created by the engineering genius of two opposing systems, awakened. Inside a German heavy Tiger tank, the crew commander, adjusting his laryngophone, felt the vibration of the 12-cylinder Maybach engine passing through his body. The smell of gasoline, synthetic leather, and gun grease created a unique aroma of war, familiar to every tank crewman. Hatches slammed shut with a dull metallic clang, cutting people off from the outside world and leaving them alone with their instruments and fate. A moment later, the horizon flared with thousands of lights, and the roar of the artillery barrage announced the beginning of an event that would forever change the course of history. To understand how two colossal forces arrived at this point at absolute tension, one must rewind time and look into the silence of staff offices. After the Battle of the Volga, where the German war machine suffered a crushing blow, strategic initiative hung in the air, like a pendulum frozen at its apex. The Eastern Front formed a huge salient thrusting deep into German defenses. For Berlin, this salient was like an open wound, but also like the greatest temptation. The operation was codenamed Citadel. At Hitler's headquarters in the Wolf's Lair, heated debates raged. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the creator of German armored forces, warned of the risks, pointing out that Soviet defenses had become different, deeper, and smarter. But the desire to regain strategic initiative and the belief in the invincibility of their weapons outweighed the arguments of reason. The plan was classic for the Prussian military school, a double strike at the base of the salient to close the encirclement. However, preparation for this offensive turned into a technological race. The German leadership decided to bet on the qualitative superiority of new equipment. At secret proving grounds and factories, work on creating wonder weapons proceeded in 3 shifts. Heavy Tiger tanks, possessing 100mm frontal armor, were practically invulnerable to most Soviet guns at long distances. Their 88mm cannon, created on the basis of the famous anti-aircraft gun, could hit targets with surgical precision at a distance of 2 kilometers. But even greater hopes were placed on the medium Panther tank. This machine, with slanted armor and a long-barreled gun, was to become the main instrument of breakthrough. Engineers hurried, but the complexity of the design played a cruel joke. Engines overheated, transmissions broke down, fire control systems required fine-tuning. Each week of delay necessary for refining the machines gave the Soviet side invaluable time. On the other side of the front, at the headquarters of the Supreme High Command, an equally complex intellectual machine was at work. Information about the impending offensive flowed in from dozens of sources. Scouts, risking their lives, captured tongues at the front. Partisans in the enemy's rear tracked the movement of echelons with equipment, and the legendary intelligence network, including the famous Cambridge 5 and the Swiss Lucy Group, transmitted copies of German orders to Moscow almost before they reached the executors at the front. Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky made an unprecedented decision: not to attack first. This went against the traditional offensive doctrine of the Red Army, but the logic was ironclad. It was necessary to force the enemy to break their best forces against prepared defenses. The Kursk salient became the most fortified territory on the planet. This was the work of millions of hands. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, women, old people, teenagers, went out into the fields with shovels to help the soldiers dig trenches. 8 defensive lines were created, with a total depth of up to 300 kilometers. Sappers played a special role. Under the cover of night, crawling on their bellies in the neutral zone, they laid hundreds of thousands of mines. The density of mining reached fantastic values. Up to 2,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines could be found on 1 kilometer of the front. Engineers created ingenious traps, controlled minefields, false trenches, camouflaged anti-tank ditches. This was not just a wall. It was a deeply echeloned system of fire, where every bush and every ravine was zeroed in by artillery. The Soviet anti-tank gun ZIS-3, light and maneuverable, became the main tool of this defense. Its crews learned camouflage so well that the gun could only be noticed after the first shot. When the spring finally uncoiled and the battle began, it immediately went beyond human comprehension. On the northern face of the Arc, where the group commanded by Walter Model was advancing, events unfolded with difficulty and sluggishness. Model, known as Hitler's fireman, had no illusions about an easy stroll. He threw heavy Ferdinand self-propelled guns into battle. These 65-ton monsters lacked a rotating turret, but their frontal armor reached 200 millimeters. Soviet cannon shells bounced off them like peas off a wall. However, the Ferdinand had a critical flaw that Soviet soldiers quickly exploited: the absence of a machine gun for close combat. Infantry, letting the steel behemoths pass through their trenches, cut off German grenadiers with fire, and then attacked the blind, self-propelled guns from the rear with Molotov cocktails. Poriri Station became a symbol of this resistance. A small settlement, turned into a fortress, changed hands dozens of times. There was no front line here in the usual sense. The battle was for every basement, for every pile of bricks. Artillerymen, whose guns were destroyed, took up submachine guns and grenades. The northern claw of the German offensive, having lost its momentum and bogged down in minefields, was broken. A completely different, far more dramatic picture unfolded on the southern face of the Arc, in the sector of the Voronezh front. Here, Army Group South, commanded by Erich von Manstein, arguably the most talented strategist of the Wehrmacht, was operating. Its striking force consisted of elite SS Panzer divisions, Leibstandart, Totenkopf, and Das Reich. These units were manned by fanatically loyal soldiers and the best equipment. It was here that the main plot unfolded, leading to the climax of the entire battle. German tanks used the Panzerkeil tactic, the tank wedge. Heavy Tigers led the way, their armor absorbing the main blow and clearing the path with their powerful guns. Behind them, fanned out, followed Panthers and modernized PZKPFW-4s, while the flanks were covered by motorized infantry in Hanomag, armored personnel carriers. Inside these steel boxes, people worked at the limit of their physical capabilities. In the fighting compartment of a Tiger, the temperature rose to 50 degrees Celsius. The loader, wrestling with heavy shells, was drenched in sweat, his hands slipping on the casings. The commander, glued to the Zeiss monocular sight, searched for targets. German optics allowed them to see the battlefield with crystal clarity, distinguishing camouflaged Soviet positions at great distances. Each shot was a strike, the recoil of the gun, the ejection of a smoking casing, and a new command. The crews worked as a single organism, where one person's mistake meant the death of all. On the other hand, Soviet artillerymen and tankers countered the enemy's technology with their ingenuity and desperate bravery. They employed the tactic of fire sacks, luring German tanks deep into their defenses, where they fell under crossfire from the flanks, where the armor was thinner. The air above the battlefield became a separate arena of combat. Soviet Il-2 attack aircraft, nicknamed by the Germans Black Death or concrete bombers, hung over German columns. An armored capsule protected the pilot and engine from ground fire, allowing the aircraft to descend to treetop level. They rained fire from cannons onto enemy equipment and dropped small-caliber anti-tank bombs that burned through the roofs of tanks, where the armor was thinnest. German Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt fighters tried to intercept the attack aircraft, and the sky was covered with black streaks of smoke trails and falling machines. By July 10th, the situation on the southern front became critical. German troops, gnawing through the defenses meter by meter, broke into open operational space. Manstein, sensing that victory was near, changed the direction of the strike. Instead of continuing a frontal assault on Oboyan, where Soviet defenses were particularly strong, he turned his tank wedges northeast, towards the Prokhorovka railway station. The terrain there was more suitable for the actions of large masses of tanks. The plan was simple and audacious: to break through Prokhorovka, get behind Soviet troops, and encircle them. The Soviet command, in the person of Stavka Representative Marshal Vasilevsky, instantly assessed the threat. It was decided to launch a counterattack. Strategic reserves were thrown into battle. The 5th Guards Tank Army under the command of General Pavel Rotmistrov. This march became a feat in itself. Tank columns moved day and night, covering hundreds of kilometers. The heat was unbearable. Dust, raised by thousands of tracks, hung in the air like a thick wall, clogging engine filters and people's lungs. Driver mechanics fell asleep right at the controls, and commanders constantly had to wake them up via intercom or by prodding. Repair crews worked on the move, changing tracks and road wheels to prevent any combat unit from falling behind. The tank crews knew they were going into the thick of it, but there was no panic in their actions, only cold determination. On July 12th, on the day of Saints Peter and Paul, 2 steel avalanches converged near the small settlement of Prokhorovka. The morning was overcast, with light rain falling, but soon the sun disappeared behind thick clouds of smoke. What happened next defies description in terms of ordinary military tactics. It was a giant melee. Battle distances were reduced to a minimum. Soviet T-34s, inferior to Tigers in range and armor thickness, had an advantage in speed and maneuverability. Soviet commanders gave the order, "Forward, to close in!" The tanks rushed towards the enemy, aiming to enter a clinch where the long guns of German tanks lost their advantage. The field near Prokhorovka turned into a boiling cauldron. Tanks fired at each other point blank, sometimes from a distance of several tens of meters. Shells pierced armor clean through. Turrets were ripped off by exploding ammunition and thrown tens of meters aside. Crews, leaping from burning vehicles, engaged in hand-to-hand combat, using pistols, knives, and sapper shovels. It was chaos, where battle control by radio became impossible due to continuous interference and shouts on the air. Everything was decided by individual training and instantaneous reaction. A T-34 driver, seeing the side of a tiger in front of him, understood that his gun might not penetrate the armor, and made the only possible decision: ramming. Accelerating his 30-ton machine, he crashed into the German giant. The impact was so powerful that welded seams burst, and the crews inside suffered severe concussions. The screech of crumpling metal drowned out even the roar of cannons. In this hell, it wasn't just two armies that clashed, but two philosophies of war. The German, based on technological perfection, elitism, and professionalism, where each crew was a unique commodity. And the Soviet, relying on mass production, simplicity, maintainability of equipment, and a collective spirit of self-sacrifice. The German gunner, accustomed to hitting targets from a comfortable distance, was shocked to see Russian tanks, despite losses, breaking through the barrage and getting behind their lines. The psychological tension was extreme. Many Wehrmacht veterans later recalled Prokhorovka as the day they first truly felt fear. Not for their lives, but from the realization that this force was unstoppable. Despite monstrous losses on both sides, the battlefield remained with Soviet troops, although technically by the end of the day, neither side had fully achieved its goals. The Germans failed to break through. Soviet tank crews failed to completely destroy the enemy. But the strategic result was unequivocal. The offensive potential of the best SS divisions was ground down to the root. Elite Panzer Grenadiers, the flower of the nation, lay in the black earth. Wehrmacht repair services could not cope with the amount of damaged equipment, and it was impossible to evacuate knocked-out Tigers and Panthers under fire. The backbone of the German tank forces, that steel axis on which the entire Blitzkrieg strategy rested, was broken. After July 12th, the initiative definitively and irrevocably passed to the Red Army. German generals, who just yesterday were drawing arrows of deep breakthroughs on maps, now had to think about saving their armies from encirclement. Operation Citadel failed. This became the point of no return. Before Kursk, Berlin could still hope for a stalemate, for a stabilization of the front, for a political solution. After Kursk, it became clear to everyone, from the private in the trench to the high command. The war was lost. The only question was time and the price that would have to be paid. The myth of the qualitative superiority of German weapons dissipated with the smoke over Prokhorovka. The Battle of Kursk also became a battle of economies. Soviet industry, evacuated beyond the Urals, was able under the most difficult conditions not just to establish the production of equipment, but to surpass the might of all of united Europe, which was working for the Reich. Simple, crude, but reliable 34s defeated the complex, capricious, and expensive-to-produce German machines. This was a lesson that in total war, victory goes to those who can supply the front, regardless of losses, to those whose system is more resilient to stress. Today, looking at yellowed photographs and museum exhibits, we try to comprehend the scale of what happened. Prokhorovka Field became Russia's third battleground, standing alongside Kulikovo and Borodino. Here, the earth still holds kilograms of iron per square meter. Archaeologists and search parties find tank parts, soldiers' personal belongings, melted pieces of armor. But the main lesson of the Battle of Kursk is a lesson of the human spirit. This is a story of how ordinary people, teachers, workers, peasants, finding themselves inside steel machines or in earthen dugouts, were able to overcome animal fear and stop absolute evil. Technology is merely a tool. A tank without a crew is a pile of metal. The outcome of the battle was decided not by millimeters of armor or gun calibers, but by the will of those who pulled the trigger. The sergeant who knocked out a tank with the last shell, the nurse who dragged a wounded man out from under fire, the factory worker who didn't leave his machine for days to give the front new engines. They were all part of this victory. The great arc straightened, turning into a direct road to the west, a road to Berlin, to the final conclusion of the most terrible catastrophe of the 20th century. Silence returned to the fields of Kursk. But in this silence, if you listen closely, the echo of that grandiose clash still resounds, reminding us of the price humanity paid for the right to live.